Sandra walked away with a broken heart and a secret that could change everything. 6 years later, a photograph of a boy with Sandra's eyes forces Mark, a successful CEO, to confront the life he lost. Before we begin the story, comment below what the country you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone! The ink on the divorce papers was barely dry when Sandra Thompson rose from the cold leather chair in the law office. Her fingers trembled as she placed the pen down, as if the act of writing her name had drained the very life from her. She avoided looking at the man seated across the table, Mark Pierce, the man she'd promised to love forever. His dark eyes were fixed on the tabletop, a muscle twitching in his jaw, betraying the emotions he refused to show. Her vision blurred as tears welled up, the weight of finality pressing against her chest like a vice. In her purse, tucked away like a cruel secret, were the shredded remains of a positive pregnancy test. She had ripped it apart in the bathroom before their meeting, as if destroying it could ease the truth that might have changed everything, or maybe nothing at all. Their love was a blazing fire, was now cold ash, and the child she carried would never know the warmth they had once shared. "Is there anything else you need?" the lawyer asked, his voice dispassionate. Just another day's work for him. "No," Sandra whispered, her voice almost breaking. She steeled herself, fingers curling around the strap of her bag. Without another word, she stood and walked out, the heels of her boots clicking against the marble floor, each step echoing with finality. Outside, the cold wind slapping her cheeks, blending with the tears she could no longer hold back. She looked up at the slate-gray sky, the air tasting of salt and regret. Her hands instinctively moved to her stomach, but she dropped it quickly. "No, don't think about it now." "Sandra!" His voice cut through the wind, raw and desperate. She hesitated, her heart twisting painfully in her chest. She closed her eyes and let the tears fall freely for a brief moment before inhaling sharply, willing her legs to move. She didn't turn back. She couldn't. The last thing she heard was the muffled thud of his footsteps stopping behind her, as if he too knew that this was the end. 6 years later, Mark stood in his kitchen, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor. The house was silent, too silent. He'd poured coffee into his mug, his hand steady, but his heart felt hollow. The routine was familiar, almost mechanical. Wake up, work out, shower, drink coffee, go to the office, repeat. The days bled together into a monotonous gray, the only break in the sameness being the ache in his chest that never fully went away, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. He'd buried himself in work, thinking it would distract him, but it never did. Sandra was gone, and so was the best part of him. He glanced at the calendar hanging on the wall, the date circled in red staring back at him. Today would have been their 10th wedding anniversary. He let out a bitter chuckle. Would have been. The past tense stung like a fresh wound. His fingers clenched around the mug's handle. A sharp knock on the door shattered his thoughts. Mark's brow furrowed as he set the coffee down and walked towards the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, a man in a brown delivery uniform handed him a large padded envelope. "Mr. Pierce?" the man asked. "Yes," Mark replied. "Sign here, please." Mark scrawled his name quickly, took the envelope, and closed the door. He turned the package over in his hands. There was no return address. His gut clenched. Something about it felt ominous. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a single photograph and a letter. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the image. It was a little boy with tousled brown hair and bright green eyes, Sandra's eyes. The boy's smile was wide and mischievous, the same kind of smile Sandra used to flash at him on lazy Sunday mornings. His hands shook as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Sandra's, elegant and flowing, but tinged with urgency. "Mark, I know you probably hate me. Maybe you've forgotten me by now, but I need you to know something. Something I should have told you 6 years ago. This is Paul. He's our son. I wanted to tell you, but by the time I found the courage, it was too late. I convinced myself that you were better off without me, without us. Maybe I was wrong. Paul deserves to know his father, and I can't keep running. If you want to meet us, we'll be at Greenleaf Park this Saturday at noon. If you don't come, I'll understand, but please know that Paul will ask about you one day, and I'll have to find a way to explain. Explain why his father didn't want to meet him. Sandra. The letter slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. Mark's knees felt weak, and he stumbled backwards until he hit the wall. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind spinning with disbelief, rage, and a tidal wave of regret. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. A son. He had a son he'd never known about. 6 lost years. Years he could never get back. His mind flashed back to the day in the law office, the look in Sandra's eyes, the way she walked away without a word. The pieces began to click into place. He should have chased her down, demanded answers, fought harder. But instead, he let her go, too consumed by his own pride and anger to see the truth. He picked up the photograph again, his eyes lingering on the boy's face. There was too much of Sandra in that little smile, but he could see a hint of himself too. In the shape of a jaw, the arch of the brow. His heart swelled with a mix of wonder and sorrow. The clock on the wall read 9:30 a.m. He had 2.5 hours to decide. 2.5 hours to change the course of his life forever. His pulse quickened. Could he do this? Could he face Sandra after everything that had happened? After 6 years of silence? He took a shaky breath and clenched his fist. The thought of missing the chance to know his son was unbearable. He couldn't let fear or pride stop him this time. The wind was cool against Sandra's cheeks as she sat on a warm wooden bench in Greenleaf Park. The sun was hidden behind a layer of gray clouds, the air heavy with a scent of damp earth. Paul played a few feet away, kicking a soccer ball around, his laughter bright and unbothered. Sandra's hands were ice cold, even though she had them buried in her coat pockets. She glanced at her watch. 11:58 a.m. 2 minutes until hope would either blossom or shatter completely. Her heart thudded painfully, her breath shallow. What if he doesn't come? Could she really handle that? A small hand tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy?" Paul's voice was soft. "Are you okay?" She forced a smile. "I'm fine, baby." Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps drew her attention. Her heart leaped into her throat. She turned her head, and there he was. Mark stood a few feet away, his chest heavy, his eyes locked on hers. A lifetime of emotions passed between them in a single, shattering moment. "Mommy, who's that?" Paul asked, his green eyes wide. Sandra swallowed the lump in her throat, tears already falling. That's your daddy." Mark's feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, his body unable to move as he took in the sight before him. Sandra's eyes were the same, a mixture of stormy gray and emerald green, both fierce and vulnerable. But there were new lines on her face, subtle marks of time and weariness he hadn't been there to witness. His gaze shifted to the boy standing beside her, the boy who was his son. Paul clung to Sandra's sleeve, his eyes curious yet weary. The world seemed to tilt beneath Mark's feet, his mind struggling to process the reality of the moment. This is real, he thought. He's real. The emotions he'd bottled up over the last 6 years, guilt, anger, regret, hope, threatened to boil over. He swallowed hard, his throat painfully dry. He took a tentative step forward, his eyes never leaving Paul. "Hi," Mark managed to say, his voice rough, almost broken. He didn't know how else to begin. How could a word so small bridge a gap so vast? Sandra's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded, encouraging him. "Paul," she whispered, kneeling beside her son. "This is Mark, your dad." Paul blinked up at Mark, his expression unreadable. "You're my dad?" he asked softly. The question hit Mark like a hammer to the chest. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. "Yes," he finally rasped. "I'm your dad." Paul stared at him for a moment longer, then tilted his head to the side, a small crease appearing between his brows. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Mark's heart shattered. The weight of the question pressed on him like 1,000 bricks. He looked at Sandra, searching for help. but her eyes were downcast, guilt etched on her face. I don't know, Mark said, his voice trembling. I didn't know about you, Paul. If I had, I would have been here. Paul seemed to consider this, his eyes scanning Mark's face with surprising intensity. After a long pause, he nodded, his shoulders relaxing a little. Okay, he said. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Mark let out a shaky breath, relief washing through him. He crouched down to Paul's level, trying to find the right words. I want to know you, Paul, if you'll let me. Paul glanced at Sandra, as if looking for reassurance. She gave him a soft smile and brushed his hair back gently. It's okay, sweetheart. You can take your time. Paul nodded again, his small fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. Can we play soccer? He asked, looking up at Mark. The request caught Mark off guard. He blinked, then let out a small, breathless laugh. Yeah, of course. I'd love that. Paul smiled, a genuine, open smile that made Mark's heart swell. He reached out and took the soccer ball from Paul, feeling its familiar weight. For the first time in years, a spark of joy flickered in his chest. The afternoon unfolded with a fragile, tentative beauty. Mark kicked the ball gently to Paul, watching his son's face light up as he dribbled and ran. They laughed together, the sound strange yet wonderful in Mark's ears. Sandra sat on the bench, watching them with a mixture of happiness and sorrow. Every now and then, Mark would glance at her, his heart aching. There was so much left unsaid between them, a chasm of misunderstandings and pain. But for now, he focused on Paul, on the miracle of this moment. After an hour of playing, Paul finally collapsed onto the grass, breathless and grinning. You're not bad, Dad, he said, the word Dad sounding both foreign and sacred. Thanks, kiddo, Mark replied, his chest tightening. Paul turned to Sandra. Mom, can we get ice cream? Sandra smiled. Sure, sweetheart. Mark hesitated. He didn't want to overstep, didn't want to ruin whatever fragile bridge they were building. But before he could say anything, Paul looked at him expectantly. Are you coming too, Dad? The invitation made Mark's throat close up. He glanced at Sandra, and for the first time, her eyes softened, a hint of a woman he used to know peeking through the walls she'd built. Come with us, she said quietly, if you want to. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to. The small ice cream parlor was tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place that smelled like sugar and childhood. They took a corner booth, Paul chattering excitedly about his favorite flavors. Mark watched him, marveling at the way his son's eyes sparkled when he spoke. How many moments like this had he missed? How many bedtime stories, scraped knees, and first words had slipped through his fingers? Sandra's voice pulled him back to the present. Vanilla and chocolate swirl, she said, handing Paul his cone. Thanks, Mom, Paul said before digging in, ice cream already dripping down his fingers. Mark smiled faintly, then turned to Sandra. You remembered my favorite, he said, looking at the cone she handed him. Mint chocolate chip. She shrugged, not meeting his eyes. Some things you don't forget. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of conversation and the jingle of the shop bells filling the space between them. Paul was absorbed in his treat, oblivious to the tension lingering in the air. Finally, Mark took a deep breath. Sandra, why didn't you tell me? Her jaw tightened, her eyes fixed on the table top. I tried, she whispered. At first, but every time I thought about telling you, I'd remember how broken we were, how much we'd hurt each other. Mark's head twisted. You didn't trust me. She looked up, her eyes filled with pain. I didn't trust us. I thought I was doing the right thing, sparing you from more pain, from being tied to me when we were falling apart. But Paul, Mark's voice cracked. You thought I wouldn't want him? Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't know, and by the time I realized I was wrong, it felt like it was too late. I was too ashamed. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. The past 6 years had been a wasteland of silence, misunderstandings, and lost time. But as he looked at Paul happily licking his ice cream, he knew one thing for certain. It's not too late, he said softly. It can't be. Sandra's gaze met his, hope flickering like a fragile flame. Paul tugged at Mark's sleeve. "Dad, look! I made a mustache," he said, grinning, ice cream smeared across his upper lip. Mark laughed, his chest aching with love. "That's the best mustache I've ever seen." Sandra's laughter joined his, and for a brief moment, the years of hurt seemed to fade, leaving behind only the sound of their shared joy. Mark wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. For the first time in 6 years, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to heal what had been broken. The drive back from the ice cream parlor was strangely quiet. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the streets, painting everything in hues of gold and amber. Paul was in the back seat, his head leaning against the window, his eyelids fluttering as he fought off sleep. The thrill of the afternoon had exhausted him. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. His mind raced with questions he hadn't asked yet, fears he hadn't voiced. Beside him, Sandra sat with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She was there, so close he could hear her breathing, but a chasm still separated them. He wanted to say something to bridge the silence, but his throat felt tight. Finally, he exhaled and glanced at her. "Sandra, can we talk?" She didn't look at him. About what? About everything. His voice was low, strained. About Paul. About us. Her fingers curled above her elbows. "We can't talk now," she whispered, casting a quick glance at Paul in the rearview mirror. "Not with him here." Mark nodded, his jaw clenching. When she hesitated, her gaze dropped to her lap. "Tonight, after he's asleep." His heart thudded harder to his chest. There was a weight to her words, a promise of truth they'd buried for too long. He didn't know if he was ready for what they'd uncover, but they couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. They arrived at Sandra's apartment just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. Mark carried a sleepy Paul, the boy's head resting on his shoulder, his breath soft and warm against his neck. The simple act of holding his son, feeling his small weight and hearing his heartbeat, made Mark's chest ache. 6 years of missed bedtimes, stories, and goodnight kisses. He couldn't get those years back, but he vowed not to lose another moment. Sandra opened the door, stepping aside to let them in. The apartment was modest, warm, and tidy. Toys were scattered in one corner, drawings taped to the refrigerator. It was a life he hadn't been part of, and the realization settled heavily in his gut. Mark followed Sandra to Paul's bedroom, a small space with blue walls and a bed covered in dinosaur sheets. He gently laid Paul down, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Paul murmured something incoherent and turned over, sinking deeper into sleep. They both stood by the bed, watching him for a moment. The quiet was thick, charged with unspoken words. Sandra finally broke the silence. "He's everything to me." "I can see that," Mark said softly. "You've done a good job with him." She let out a shaky breath. "I tried, but it's hard doing it alone." Mark's heart tightened. "You didn't have to do it alone." Sandra flinched, guilt flashing across her face. She turned away, walking out of the room. Mark followed her to the living room, the air between them tense and raw. She crossed her arms and faced him, her eyes guarded. "I know I made a mistake. I should have told you," she said, her voice trembling. "But back then, we were falling apart. I didn't think you wanted me, let alone a baby." Mark ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You didn't even give me a chance, Sandra. You didn't let me try." "I was scared," her voice cracked, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You didn't know what it felt like to stand in the bathroom holding that test, knowing everything was about to change. And when we sat in the lawyer's office and you didn't even look at me, I thought it was over, that we were over." Mark took a step towards, his hands shaking. "I was angry. I was hurt, but I never stopped loving you." She let out a broken laugh, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Love wasn't enough to save us then." "Maybe not," he said, his voice rough. "But it's enough to try again now, isn't it?" Sandra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "I don't know if we can fix this, Mark. There's too much history, too much pain." He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "I don't care how long it takes. I want a chance to be in his life and in yours." She looked away, her shoulders trembling. "I don't know if I can trust you." His heart sank. "Then let me earn it." Silence stretched between them, heavy with uncertainty. Finally, she nodded, almost imperceptibly. We'll take it slow, for Paul's sake. Relief flooded through him. It wasn't a promise, but it was a chance, and that was more than he'd had this morning. Days turned into weeks. Mark became a fixture in Paul's life, a quiet presence who picked him up from school, helped with homework, and learned the intricacies of bedtime stories and dinosaur facts. They built a fragile routine, each day stitching together the pieces of a relationship that had been broken for too long. Mark's bond with Paul grew stronger, but the space between him and Sandra remained. They were polite, careful not to step on the cracks beneath their feet, but the air was always charged, the memory of what they once shared hovering like a ghost. One crisp October evening, Mark arrived at the apartment to find Sandra sitting on the balcony, a steaming mug in her hands. The sky was painted in shades of pink and purple, a chill settling over the city. Paul was at a sleepover, the apartment unusually quiet. "Hey," he said softly, stepping into the balcony. She looked up, her eyes weary but soft. "Hey." He leaned against the railing beside her, the silence stretching out. The wind teased strands of her hair, and the fading light cast a glow on her face. She looked beautiful, a bittersweet ache spreading through his chest. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, his voice low. "The night we signed the papers?" Sandra's fingers tightened under her mug. "Every day." He swallowed hard. "I wish I hadn't been so indifferent to you before. I wish I'd known how to fight for us." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I wish I hadn't run." He turned to face her, his heart pounding. "We've lost so much time, Sandra, but I don't want to lose any more." She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. For the first time, the walls she'd built seemed to crack. "I'm scared, Mark. What if we hurt each other again?" He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We will. We're human. But maybe this time, we'll fight together." Her lips trembled, her eyes searching his face. "And Paul?" "We show him that love isn't perfect," Mark whispered, "but it's worth fighting for." A sob escaped her lips, and she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as if the world might shatter if he let go. "I missed you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I missed you so much." Tears blurred his vision. "I missed you too." For the first time in 6 years, they stood together, the pieces of their broken hearts slowly, tentatively fitting back together. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act, where a single misstep could send everything crashing down. Mark treaded carefully, showing up for Paul and Sandra without pushing too hard. Every morning he woke with cautious hope, wondering if today would be the day Sandra fully let him back in. Some days she smiled more easily. Other days, the walls crept back up. But each moment they shared chipped away at the distance that still lingered between them. One Saturday afternoon, they decided to take Paul to a fall festival at the park. The air was crisp with the scent of cinnamon and freshly baked goods. Paul dashed ahead, his laughter blending with the sound of children's games and carnival music. Mark watched him with a soft smile, his heart swelling. He felt more like a father every day. Sandra walked beside him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The golden leaves crunched under their feet as they strolled down the path. She glanced at him, her eyes warm but uncertain. "You seem happier lately," she said softly. He nodded, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting her gaze. "I am. Being here with you and Paul, it's everything I didn't know I was missing." She hesitated, her breath catching. "It's been nice having you around. Paul adores you." "And you?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling. Sandra's eyes shimmered with uncertainty. "I'm scared to trust this, Mark, to trust us." "I know," he replied, "but I'm not going anywhere this time. I promise." Before she could respond, Paul's voice called out, "Mom! Dad! Come see this!" The word dad still sent a jolt through Mark's heart, a mixture of joy and disbelief. They followed Paul to a booth where children were painting pumpkins. Paul grabbed a small, round pumpkin and held up a paintbrush. "Can we do this together?" he asked, his eyes wide and hopeful. Mark and Sandra exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Of course, Sandra said, kneeling beside Paul. Mark crouched on the other side, picking up a paintbrush. What shall we paint, bud? Paul's brow furrowed in concentration. A family of pumpkins, like us. Mark's throat tightened, and he shared a look with Sandra. Her eyes glistened, but she nodded, a small smile breaking through. They worked together in comfortable silence, their fingers smudged with paint. Paul giggled as Mark accidentally painted a crooked smile on one of the pumpkins. Sandra reached down and wiped a streak of paint from Mark's cheek, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. When they finished, 3 pumpkins sat side by side, one tall, one medium, and one small, each with matching smiles. Paul clapped his hands, his face glowing with pride. It's us, he said. Our family. Mark swallowed hard, his heart swelling with hope. Yeah, it is. Later that night, after they'd put Paul to bed, Mark lingered in the living room. Sandra stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. The moonlight filtered through their curtains, casting a soft glow on her face. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking. Sandra, we can't keep dancing around this. She turned to face him, her eyes full of vulnerability. I know. I want us to be a family, not just for Paul, but for us too. I want to try again, to build something better this time. Her eyes searched his face, looking for cracks or hesitation. What if we fail again? We might, he admitted, but I'd rather try and fail than spend another 6 years wondering what could have been. She took a shaky breath, tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm so tired of being afraid. He stepped forward, gently cupping her face in his hands. Then let's be brave together. Her lips trembled and she closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were filled with a cautious hope. Okay, she whispered. The word was small but carried the weight of everything they'd been through. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, tentative at first, but when she responded, the kiss deepened. Years of longing and regret dissolved into a moment of pure, unfiltered connection. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless, tears mingling with smiles. We'll take it one day at a time, he said. She nodded, a soft laugh escaping her. One day at a time. The weeks that followed were filled with cautious joy. Mark spent more nights at Sandra's apartment, their routines intertwining like vines growing toward the light. They took Paul on more outings, to museums, parks, and movie nights on the couch. The laughter came easier, the silences less heavy. One rainy afternoon, Paul came bounding into the living room clutching a piece of paper, his cheeks flushed with excitement. Look what I've made! He exclaimed, waving the paper. Mark took it and smiled. It was a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. Above them, in wobbly letters, were the words, My Family. Sandra knelt beside Paul, her eyes glistening. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Paul beamed. Can we put it on the fridge? Absolutely, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. They walked to the kitchen together, and Paul proudly struck the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet. Mark's eyes lingered on a simple, powerful words, My Family. It felt real now, not perfect, not fixed, but real. The first snowfall of the season came in December, blanketing the city in white. The air was crisp and clean. Paul bounced with excitement, pressing his nose to the window. Can we go outside? Please? He begged. Mark grinned. Only if your mom says it's okay. Sandra laughed, already reaching for their coats. Let's do it. They bundled up and stepped into the winter wonderland. Paul squealed, running ahead to make snow angels. Mark caught Sandra's hand in his, their breath mingling in the cold air. He squeezed her fingers. Are you happy? He asked. She looked at him, her eyes shining. I'm getting there. They walked together, the snow crunching under their feet. Paul's laughter echoed with the stillness, a sound so pure it made Mark's chest ache with joy. Suddenly, Paul called out, Let's build a snowman! A big one! They laughed and joined him, rolling the snow into large, uneven balls. Mark lifted Paul onto his shoulder so he could place the head on top. Sandra found stones for the eyes and a scarf to wrap around the neck. When they finished, the snowman stood lopsided and grinning, but it was perfect. Paul clapped his gloved hands together, his face lit with joy. We did it! He shouted. Mark's heart swelled as he looked at his son, then at Sandra. Snowflakes dusted her hair, her cheeks flushed with cold and happiness. He reached down and brushed a snowflake from her nose. "I love you," he whispered, the words tumbling out of before he could stop them. Her eyes widened, then softened. "I love you too." It was the first time they'd said it in years, but it felt as natural as breathing. Paul turned, his smile wide. "Are we a family now?" he asked. Mark knelt, pulling Paul into his arms. "Yeah, buddy, we're a family." Sandra wrapped her arms around them both, her laughter mingling with tears. The snow fell softly around them, the world hushed and perfect. And for the first time in a long time, they were home. Mark's journey teaches us that it takes vulnerability and courage to rebuild relationships after they've been shattered. Love isn't about perfection, but about trying again, step by step. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories. Don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen.